Story 1. When I was diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder and shared my intrusive thoughts, she told me, just ignore it. I wondered why I hadn't thought of that myself. This advice didn't help me at all. My mother often says the same thing, but as a newly diagnosed 9-year-old with frightening and confusing intrusive thoughts, I needed guidance on how to ignore them. Fortunately, I found a better therapist who helped me identify the root cause of my anxiety. She explained that constantly fighting the thoughts only makes them return. Instead, I learned to let the intrusive thoughts pass by, like an annoying neighbor, because those negative thoughts will never come true. This approach has helped me much more. Story 2. I was a very shy and depressed kid at the time, so I was not good at advocating for myself. I asked my school for help, and they sent me to a counselor. I would say maybe a few sentences per session. He spoke for the rest of the time. He told me to bring my parents in and then informed them that I had told him that I hated them. It was a bad breach of privacy if I had said that. I had never said that, and it was not remotely true. It took a long time to go back to therapy after that. Thank you for nothing. Story 3. There were many signs that I overlooked. The exact moment I realized it was when I started private therapy with him instead of through the rape charity I had been using. When I entered his private space, it was his bedroom. Then he said to me, "Hey, you can just get on my bed and sleep, and I can watch you for an hour." He then charged me for the experience. I didn't actually get on the bed and sleep. He charged me for the discomfort of sitting for an hour while he said strange things to me. He was taking my money in cash. When I left the house and got in the car, I thought, that was uncomfortable. Then he texted me and asked, "What time were you born? And in what hospital?" It turns out he wanted to get an astrological chart done on me. Of all the things that should have been a red flag for me, it was the astrology chart that pushed me over the edge. Story 4. I told her I felt like I had dug myself a hole and couldn't get out. I needed help finding my way out. She said, "You seem well-adjusted and coping fine. Why are you here?" My next therapist diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. Story 5. I have a wonky knee that I inherited from my father. She said it was symbolic of my issues with my dad, and here I was thinking it was just genetics. Story 6. When I was lamenting having to live with an obnoxious housemate who frequently used a racial slur at the top of his voice, she asked, "But why does that make you so angry?" Then she inquired why I felt I did not deserve to live alone, as if that was the only possible reason I was living with housemates in her mind. Of course, I feel I deserve to live by myself, but the rent for living alone in London would consume most of my salary each month. I don't understand why she didn't grasp the concept of the cost of living. She cried when I told her I felt I no longer needed to come to her. She said she had failed me. I sat there for about 10 minutes because I didn't know what to do. It was so uncomfortable. She can go away. Story 7. I had a difficult childhood due to my parents' substance abuse issues, and when I was 8, they decided that I should go into counseling. At that point, they had temporarily pulled themselves together. I was a chubby kid, not extremely overweight, but carried a few extra pounds. This was all the therapist would discuss. She told my mom that if I lost weight, all my problems would take care of themselves. Since my parents were not good at taking responsibility for their actions, they appreciated this distraction. The benefit of my parents' changes not being permanent was that they never made me see that therapist again. Story 8. I started figuring out that I have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder with her. I needed her referral for a psychologist to get a diagnosis. She agreed. When the referral came in, it was for anxiety and depression, with a note specifically stating that I do not have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The contradictory nature confused me. I went to a psychologist who confirmed that I have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I'm on medication now, and my life is great. I now have a therapist who also has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and I'm learning so much about myself. But yeah, what the heck? Story 9. When I told her I felt suicidal and was scared of what could possibly happen when I leave, she said she was proud of me for all the progress I mentioned during our session. Story 10. When I discussed my body image concerns with her for the first time, She told me I was wrong and that I didn't actually have those issues. I was simply confusing them with some other emotional problem. Why? Because I was her most attractive patient. Story 11. Do not use BetterHelp under any circumstances. I don't understand why YouTubers still sponsor them so frequently. Story 12. I told her I thought I was losing my grip on reality. Her response was to tell me to reframe it positively to say, "You have a strong grasp on non-reality." Story 13. When she tried to sell me her friend's book about how crystals can heal you, it made me uneasy. To make matters worse, she identified as the atheist, no-nonsense option on a mental health platform. I never sought therapy from there again. Story 14. My husband and I went to a couples therapist because we wanted help with our communication. We were a very happy couple, but when we argued, it felt like we were speaking two different languages. We weren't on the brink of divorce. We just wanted some tools to help navigate conflict. Our therapist started every session by asking, "So, what are we arguing about this week?" To which my husband and I responded, "Nothing," because we rarely argued. The therapist would then provoke us into an argument, and we would argue for 45 minutes. He would cut us off and say, "Look, your problems are small. The things you argue about are trivial. You just have to let them go." In our final meeting, I snapped at him and said, "It's not small. I'm telling you that I feel disrespected and invalidated. And that's not a trivial issue." He never gave us any homework, communication exercises, or advice. I would usually leave in tears, while my husband would leave feeling like he had won the argument or the therapy session. It was far more destructive than helpful. Now, 6 months away from finishing my doctoral degree in clinical psychology, the more I learn about what psychotherapy should and should not be, the more horrified I am by this experience. Story 15. When I went there for my alcohol abuse, I had just hit 1 year sober. I shared a lot of information during my first visit, and we scheduled another appointment for that same Friday. It was Monday, so I was happy he could see me twice in 1 week. He seemed interested in my story. Friday came, and I started where I left off, but he had no idea who I was and knew nothing about my story, as if I had never been there on Monday. Being sober for a year was significant to me. It was a milestone, and I was proud of myself. However, over the course of the session, I noticed he dropped his pen several times, and on the 4th time he let out a little giggle as he picked it up. I know the signs of an alcoholic, and I could smell it when he bent over and I caught a strong whiff of scotch. I asked him, "Are you drunk?" He obviously refused. So I said, "You were driving less than 20 minutes ago. Maybe I should call the police to have you breathalyzed, considering you were driving while I was in your waiting room." He immediately folded and admitted he drinks in the morning to cope. At that point, I was desperately looking for a psychiatrist. It was during COVID-19, and nobody was taking on new clients. However, he had a woman in his building with whom he was good friends. I said, "Get me in as a patient of hers, and I'll drop this." Less than an hour later, I received a call informing me I had a new psychiatrist. That was 4 years ago, and she's still my doctor. A blessing in disguise, right? Story 16. I asked reception for a replacement because I felt threatened while talking to him. He kept blaming all my problems on me. He swapped back in for the next session. I have not returned to that place since then. Story 17. When he told me I didn't have bipolar disorder because people with bipolar disorder have a specific look behind the eyes, which I don't have, I found it laughable as I exhibit textbook symptoms of bipolar disorder type 1. Story 18. When they told me that I should go find Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, I went to a therapist because someone at the organization recommended it. Story 19. She told me it was impossible for me to have an eating disorder because I wasn't underweight. She didn't know my weight. I went to a different professional and was diagnosed with anorexia. Story 20. I always showed up to my online appointments on time, logged in, and waited for her to start the call. Sometimes she was a few minutes late, which is understandable, but once she was 20 minutes late. When I asked her about it, she claimed she had been waiting the whole time and that I was the one who was late. I had used the same system with 2 other providers and had never experienced this issue before or since. I told her I disagreed and started sending her screenshots of the page showing I was waiting for her after 5 to 10 minutes. She would log on, flustered, and ask why I was late again. It was pretty obvious from her tone and body language and how defensive she became that she knew she was at fault but did not want to admit it. I suspect she was living in a different state than the one she reported to her employer, which I believe is illegal, causing time zone issues with her appointments. Being late is one thing, but blaming me to save face was too much. I was pretty sure she was inadequate before that, but it was the final blow. Story 21. When they were transphobic to my face and denied it when confronted. They claimed to have gay friends as if that meant anything. Story 22. She was released from the hospital, but she only saw me for 15 minutes per session. What kind of work can be done in 15 minutes? She never initiated the conversation, not even with a simple, "How are you?" She just waited for me to start. She waited for a depressed, quiet, closed-off woman to open the conversation. Thankfully, I have had a wonderful therapist since 2021 who has been following me closely and has helped me overcome many challenges. However, that previous therapist was not helpful. Story 23. When the psychologist told me to stop coming to the free government clinic, which I qualified for, and to see her at her expensive private practice because I was taking services away from those who needed them more, it was not a great thing to say to a suicidal teenager. I felt evil and not worth the effort to be saved. She referred me to a psychiatrist, and for the first time, I experienced a mental health professional who actually cared about my quality of life. Story 24. I first saw her after being hospitalized for a suicide attempt due to an overdose. We sat down, and she began with, "So, you had a bit of a meltdown over the weekend." Those words ensured that I would never open up to her about anything in the 3 required sessions that followed, during which she mainly talked about herself anyway. Story 25. When I was a teenager in high school, I tried to take my own life, and a therapist told me I wasn't really depressed because I wore makeup and styled my hair. I never went back. Thankfully, as an adult, I now have an amazing therapist. Story 26. As a depressed 11-year-old, I was sent to the school therapist. I was going through a goth phase, which was uncommon in my area at that time, and my therapist advised my dad to check me into a psychiatric ward on Halloween to prevent me from hurting anyone. I never indicated that I wanted to hurt myself or others. Kids spread rumors saying that I was going to turn them into a toad because I was considered a witch, and the school thought I was involved in satanic practices. It was the tail end of the satanic panic. My dad did not heed her advice, but I refused to see that therapist again. Story 27. When she started crying, she interrupted the session and told me she needed to see her own therapist. Story 28. He insisted on sitting next to me and telling me how beautiful I was. I was clearly in a very dark place for allowing this to happen more than once. She would cry for me, all the while complaining that I wasn't crying. Story 29. When he groomed me over a period of 2.5 to 3 years, it only ended last year when I finally told someone. That psychiatrist ruined my life. I have not yet reported him because I am too scared. Story 30. My therapy topic was miscarriage and grief. Once, the therapist got a bit annoyed when I talked about worrying all the time about the small things. She mentioned that you cannot worry about every little thing. When you have children, you will understand that you need to worry about them all the time and nothing else matters. Well, I just experienced a miscarriage, so thanks for this advice. Needless to say, I never went back. Story 31. Not my therapist, but my psychiatrist. I was running low on medication, so I tried to call to set up an appointment. 1 week later, I was still unable to contact him or his office. Then, I searched for information about him and discovered that he murdered his wife and then took his own life. They had an infant child. Story 32. I once visited a therapist for my communication issues. At that time, I wasn't diagnosed with autism and thought I just had a kind of social anxiety that could be cured. I told the therapist that it had always been very difficult for me to talk to people, sometimes even physically. Her reactions included, "What? Why? But you're speaking right now just fine. Have you been to a neurologist? It's not normal to be unable to speak when you want to." Well, Maybe you should wear a t-shirt that says, "I'm not ignoring you. I'm just thinking about what to say next." That way, people won't be offended. It felt as if I was sharing my struggles with a random person on the street instead of a qualified therapist. Story 33. When she stood me up for our first session, she texted me the next day, saying she had to charge me because I was a no-show. I brought it to her attention and she apologized, but that was unprofessional. Story 34. Not me, but my partner's therapist was trying to push an anti-LGBTQ narrative during one of the sessions. That was enough for us to never go back. Story 35. I had court-ordered therapy as a probation condition. I attended 2 sessions with the therapist, who sent a detailed report to the probation officer discussing my bisexuality and specific factors that made me anxious. The therapist, who is a gay man, suggested that my parents did not accept my bisexuality, despite their support from the beginning. I believe I know my parents better than he does. The next therapist I saw only informed the courts that I was completing my therapy. Story 36. I had the best therapist ever and she retired. I was switched to another therapist whose approach was to list my many faults and flaws. While sitting there, I was reminded of the John Belushi mashed potato scene from Animal House and thought, now what am I? That was it for me. I got up and walked out of the session. Story 37. I was undergoing a movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, but at the end of each session, I felt as if my brain was a raw, open wound. It took me a week to begin to feel whole again, only to face another session that left me feeling raw and exposed. I was an emotional wreck. Things were bad. Very bad. People had been praising the therapy, so I thought perhaps this was a normal reaction. No, it was not supposed to be like that. I was having a negative response to it, and my trauma was worsening. My therapist did not seem to recognize the extent of the turmoil I was experiencing. It was truly overwhelming. She also mentioned that my aura was incredibly strong. Story 38. She told me that I was too young for the issues I described and that I should just go to work because she wasn't going to support my illusions anymore. I transferred to her after already being in therapy for a year because my previous therapist moved away. You might wonder why I sought therapy in the first place. The reasons included a work-related burnout, multiple nervous breakdowns, the death of 2 close family members, an older cousin who abused me from ages 12 to 15, and a strong desire to end it all. This therapist dismissed my struggles during our second session and released me from therapy. I was 19 when this happened, and I can honestly say that I am only alive today because I was so angry and determined not to let her or anyone else win. I pulled myself out of that dark place. I still work on sorting things out even now, almost 20 years later. The trauma makes it really hard to have a normal, non-degrading sexual relationship with anyone. It's strange how the things that harmed me the most in my youth became twisted in my mind to feel like they were meant to be that way. However, I am now in a really good place mentally, and I am happy with who I am for the first time in my life. So maybe, in some twisted way, I should thank her for that. But I really wonder how many people may have taken their own lives because of how she treated me. Story 39. It was past therapists who never taught me anything about managing my own mental health. I would go to therapy and discuss my week, believing that was all therapy was meant to be. However, it is supposed to be more than that. You are meant to learn coping mechanisms, breathing techniques, distraction strategies, and safe space strategies. In my 5 years of therapy with 6 different therapists, only one has provided this guidance. Story 40. She made me feel like I was being scolded by my dad. That was quite uncomfortable. We had just had a whole session about him too. Story 41. I wouldn't say she was terrible. She definitely wasn't right for me, though. It became clear when our sessions boiled down to, tell me your problems. I'll repeat them back to you. Then you'll come back next week. While this approach might be effective for some, I wanted someone who not only listened but also provided homework and strategies to work on outside of our sessions. Story 42. An older woman therapist suggested that I was promiscuous and then stopped responding by canceling all appointments and not returning any calls. Story 43. I had an acupuncturist years ago who tried to convince me that chicken soup was some kind of cure-all. He kept asking if I could make an exception in my vegetarian diet to accommodate it. Story 44. When she told me I should consider using a donor egg or surrogacy during my therapy session for miscarriage. Story 45. I told her about my traumas, and she would say something like, "Have you tried getting 15 minutes of sunlight a day?" I'm not saying that doesn't help, but I'm not going to pay $200 a week to hear something I can find on WebMD. After my first month, I stopped seeing her. Story 46. When I had been sitting there for an hour, 15 minutes of which was about my issues and 45 minutes of which was about her recent minor facial paralysis and numbness, as well as her attempts at training a new rescue collie as a therapy dog. Story 47. I joked about committing suicide with my .25 caliber handgun. They laughed and said they could offer me a stronger handgun like a 9mm. Oh wait, that was my dad who offered that. Story 48. I saw a therapist for years to address my depression and anxiety. She was great. Then she left and I was assigned to a therapist who did not help me with my issues and only listened to my grandmother about my grades, which were not bad, just not the best. She would criticize me during sessions, which made my anxiety worse. I stopped going after that. Story 49. During the second appointment, she told me that my mother was unkind for encouraging me to reflect on myself during conflicts. I responded by saying that my mother likely did not understand better and preferred that I focus on self-reflection rather than becoming a person who never questions himself. She became angry and told me it was not her job to engage in such discussions. She believed I was not ready for therapy, thought we were not a good match, and wished me luck in finding another therapist. Story 50. My mom forced me to see a therapist when I was 12 because, as she said, she didn't want me to turn out like my older sister, who was struggling with self-harm and depression due to our mother's abuse. I didn't think there was anything wrong with my sister, so I was very upset that she said that. The man she sent me to hardly talk to me. I was crying and scared, and he just asked, "Do you normally cry like this?" He didn't seem to know how to talk to kids and didn't try to make me feel comfortable or ask any questions other than that. Then he ended the session early and told my mom that he couldn't work with me because I wasn't cooperating. That was that. I talked to my older sister recently about this event, and it turns out our mom dragged her to the same therapist's office and told her that she didn't want her to end up like our eldest sister. My sister said the therapist was aggressive and snapped at her because she didn't know how to talk to him either. We really desperately needed help. Story 51. My old psychiatrist said I was a very beautiful young woman. He mentioned that he would go to the movies with me, which was certainly unorthodox. Story 52. I mentioned to my psychiatrist that I am gay, and she responded, "Oh honey, that's okay. You have plenty of time to change your mind." Story 53. When I started opening up about my issues, she began to ignore my appointments. She canceled multiple appointments and was not attentive during our sessions. I was already dealing with many people walking away from my life, which was quite ironic. ChatGPT has helped me more than several therapists over the years, honestly. Story 54. I could be the bad guy here, but my therapist knew I suffered from panic disorder and struggled to leave the house. I told him one morning a few hours before the appointment that I was struggling and would need to cancel. And his reply was that I owed him €100 because I hadn't given him a day's notice. I then realized that he didn't care about me and stopped going to him after I paid. He wasn't worth the hassle of arguing over the €100. Story 55. During a year of therapy, my therapist primarily focused on my grief. I tried to delve into deeper issues that were causing me distress, such as my inability to control my weight and the sexual assault I experienced at school. However, she consistently redirected the conversation to my grieving process. Story 56. The person let me talk about olive oil for 45 minutes. I made 3 false statements during that time, and he agreed with me all 3 times. Additionally, he allowed me to go on about olive oil for an extended period. Story 57. When he told me I didn't have bipolar disorder because people with bipolar disorder have a specific look in their eyes that I don't have, I realized I am textbook bipolar type 1. Story 58. When she told me I was selfish for wanting to move home to Ohio, my stepfather had passed away years prior from cancer. My mother hadn't had a job since his passing, and she said, "You have a life here," referring to Alabama. I didn't. My life ended along with my stepfather. Story 59. I was 100 pounds overweight and pre-diabetic. I told my therapist I wanted to lose weight, and she said I didn't love myself. Story 60. When I told her that I would likely have issues getting pregnant, she suggested that I insert myself into one of my friend's children's lives to maintain that connection. She also made us both wear masks due to her being immunocompromised, which was understandable. However, she kept asking me to speak up, complaining that she couldn't hear me because the mask was muffling my voice. I already had enough difficulty speaking up for myself, so that was the final straw. I lasted 3 sessions before I decided to stop seeing her, and I regretted going back after the first visit. Story 61. I told a friend about my first session with the therapist, who incidentally had 16 cats in their home where they practiced, 8 downstairs and 8 upstairs. My friend said, "Sounds like you gave them a session?" It took me 2 more sessions to realize, I really don't have time for this because I'm getting nowhere. The sheer amount of scheduled commitments I have to rearrange just to attend these sessions isn't worth it. This therapist is known as the cat therapist when I retell the story. Story 62. When I caught her falsifying my medical records and confronted her, she tried to manipulate the situation and make me out to be the bad guy. Luckily, I recognized her tactics and they didn't work on me. Then her supervisor attempted to cover for her and wouldn't let me file a complaint. Story 63. One therapist I saw in middle school seemed to judge me for being there since my parents weren't divorced. I guess that was the only reason I should have been depressed. Another therapist I saw for chronic pain as an adult repeatedly interrupted me to talk about himself or to express his thoughts. I saw both only once and never went back to them. Thankfully, I have been seeing the best therapist for 6 years now. Story 64. Telling me that my medical problem, for which I was hospitalized for 5 days, was all in my head and my fault for not managing stress better was frustrating. She advised against taking the medications provided by the physician and suggested instead using apple cider vinegar shots. Why did she feel qualified to give medical advice? She studied to become a cardiologist but did not obtain any degree or certifications. After realizing she could not navigate the system, she became a therapist. She kept questioning the diagnosis my doctor gave me, saying, "What are the chances? That's a really rare condition. I think you're just overthinking these symptoms. Ma'am, you are not qualified to give any opinion on these matters." Story 65. Oh boy, I have one. When I missed one appointment, I apologized and said I could still pay for it. But she insisted that I didn't come because I didn't want to. I argued that I really did forget and actually wanted to attend, but she didn't believe me. This made me quit therapy, and then she tried to persuade me not to, saying that I was pushing her away like the rest of my family. The wildest thing was when she said, "So we had therapy for 9 months. Isn't it quite symbolic?" It felt as if she wanted to take the place of my deceased mother, which was very unsettling. She was a highly educated psychiatrist but seemed to have her own attachment issues. I didn't recognize this for a long time because I tried to trust the professional. The first signs I ignored were probably how much she talked about herself. Story 66. I needed a document from her for a possible disability, and she stated that I am unable to work. In the next therapy session, when I mentioned that I struggle with having any spending money, she smiled sweetly and said, "Well, maybe you should get a job." Story 67. I had one when I was 12. I just finished telling him that my dad was hurting me. He essentially told me to forgive my dad. Story 68. My biggest issue was that my therapist wouldn't acknowledge that my life was objectively difficult. I have no friends, no relationships, no hobbies, a challenging job, and I practice no self-care. This is not just a problem of mindset. My life is objectively bad. Nobody would feel okay in my situation. Let's acknowledge this and work on addressing it instead of just thinking positively. Story 69. I have many things to say as someone who has had numerous terrible experiences with psychiatrists. I skimmed through a variety of unhelpful and sometimes humorous reviews in search of a professional. But the worst psychiatrist I ever had was the one who wouldn't allow me to discuss my private life. Any personal information I tried to share was met with, "Shut up. I'm not supposed to know that about you." Under these conditions, I couldn't even explain what was wrong and why I was seeing him. I quickly gave up, being 16 and very shy, and allowed him to dictate our sessions. I was essentially paying someone to ask about my week. He inquired about my meals, my job, or my cleaning routines, but when the conversation turned personal, I was yelled at. Ironically, he wanted extensive details about random topics, and he would scream at me if I didn't comply. The whole experience was maddening. I was in distress, but I was forced to discuss each of my meals for at least 20 minutes because he wanted to know how I opened jars. The last session was the breaking point because it became incredibly strange. He sat with his eyes closed, spread his legs widely, and asked me to imagine two versions of myself. He then inquired about their ages, how they were doing, and why they were like that, as well as if I could feel my red blood cells. I responded, no, and he yelled in frustration. He then asked what I could feel in my mouth, to which I answered, I guess my saliva. The session ended abruptly, leaving me flabbergasted. As I was paying, he told me, we're going to film the next session. I replied, I'm not comfortable with that, I think. His response was, I'm not asking you. He added, you're going home by train, right? Well, you know the two versions of yourself we talked about? You're going to see them on the train. They will follow you. Ironically, I had initially sought a psychiatrist because I was struggling with distinguishing reality from delusion and was afraid of going insane. Because I was never allowed to discuss anything private. He had no idea of my fears. Hearing that comment made me completely lose my composure. I was scared for weeks, never returned, and I still dislike that psychiatrist years later. Story 70. When she kept trying to convince me that my father had sexually abused me and I had repressed it, I felt furious. He never did and never would. While I had some issues with him, it was nothing like that. Story 71. My experience wasn't terrible. She was quite helpful, and I wasn't there for anything serious, mostly regarding a breakup. When the appointments became unnecessary, I decided enough was enough and called to say that I wouldn't be returning, as it wasn't needed. She became quite forceful and agitated, insisting that I must come back for a final appointment. I declined. Story 72. I was put in therapy when I was 9. The reason I stopped going is that my therapist told me she wasn't surprised I was struggling to make friends in school because I talked too much. Her statement diminished my ability to open up to her, as I was constantly fearful of talking too much and irritating her. Reflecting on my life, I believe that one of the few mature adults in my life saying she wasn't surprised that people didn't like me contributed to my feeling fundamentally unlikable and led to my self-isolation throughout elementary school. Story 73. She seemed annoyed with me when I spoke about my life and issues, which is the purpose of therapy. Her advice was so generic that I felt I could have just looked up my symptoms online and found the same information. It was my first experience in therapy, and I wondered if my expectations were too high or if I was truly difficult to listen to. I shared my experience with friends, and they said this behavior is not typical for a therapist. I stopped seeing her shortly after that. Story 74. It wasn't my therapist, but about 2 years before my ex and I decided to end our relationship, she asked if I would be willing to see her therapist to work on some of our issues as a couple. I agreed because I recognized that things weren't great, and we went. It was 2 hours of asking why I was doing things wrong, and I responded to these questions without exploring any part of us. I didn't go back. Story 75. I was present to address the divorce. I was asked to meet with my ex for a session. I listened to her untruths and felt she took her side against mine. Story 76. I have had a few remarkable interactions with different mental health professionals. Therapist/counselor community program I was referred to in high school. He seemed to have some intuition that made him think I was queer. Every time I spoke about my best friend, who is a girl, he would switch between saying we sounded codependent and toxic, and suggesting that I consider dating a girl as a form of therapeutic advice. I don't think I ever explicitly mentioned my sexuality. I didn't even open up about my gender identity struggles until my final session with him. I'm still quite confused. What grown man suggests that a teenage girl date a girl as therapeutic advice? I'm also pretty sure he shared confidential information with my mother, though that may have just been a hunch or paranoia. I always felt she didn't like me going to see him. That school also attempted to provide me with therapy through our chaplain and an older woman who practiced art therapy. They were very religiously oriented, which made it an uncomfortable environment for me to talk in. Additionally, after spending 10 minutes with a psychiatrist when I was 21, he diagnosed me with borderline personality disorder and interrupted me every time I tried to explain a symptom. I ended up crying in the bathroom and never went back to him. You can interpret that as you wish. Story 77. While in university, I was advised to see the therapist for students in the building. I had gone through something traumatic and was struggling significantly, which affected my performance. It quickly became clear to me that she was accustomed to dealing with typical student issues like performance anxiety and financial problems. She provided temporary solutions instead of addressing the root of the problem. For example, due to my past experiences, I was overly aware of noises around me to ensure my safety, and I couldn't listen to music through headphones anymore because I needed to stay alert to my surroundings. However, I still wanted to enjoy music without disturbing others at night. Instead of helping me with these issues, she simply advised me to soundproof my room. I laugh about it now, and fortunately, I didn't give up on therapists. One I saw about 6 years later actually helped me turn my life around for the better. Story 78. Once, I was in couples counseling with my husband, and I told the therapist, who is a woman, that I was bothered that my husband's friend sent him half-nude pictures of some Instagram model. I said that if my husband wasn't interested, as he claimed, he should put a stop to it. The therapist sighed and responded, "Boys will be boys. Come on, women do it too. Sometimes even worse." I just picked up my bag and left. My husband and she continued the session, and he probably told her, "See, this is how she overreacts." Story 79. When I went to her for a solution, she gave me a response that sounded like she was justifying corrective actions by altering the details and phrasing it differently. Story 80. When he told me everything said in the room would be held in the strictest confidence, my dad went in for a few minutes at the end of the session. On the drive home, he brought up what I had discussed. A few years later, I went at the demand of the school. Again, I was given the same confidentiality assurance. I confided in him about an embarrassing incident and asked him to keep it between us. Guess what was detailed on the first page of his report? Consequently, I have zero trust in the psychiatric establishment or its practitioners. I understand that confidentiality can be broken in situations where the patient poses a threat to themselves or others. Cringy teenage behavior does not meet that standard. Story 81. I have yet to have a relationship that didn't end with me being cheated on. It's not a large sample size, but there have been several girlfriends and my now ex-wife. If I'm honest, it bothers me in a maybe I'm the issue kind of way, but it's more of a troubling fact than anything. Anyway, I experienced deep depression from my divorce and started therapy. I told my new therapist this whole story, and he looked at me and asked, "And that's why you hate women? Just what?" I told him that this wasn't going to work and that I would find a different therapist. The joke's on me. I never did, but I am still better off than dealing with that. Story 82. When I had a complete mental breakdown the last time he was in office and he stacked the Supreme Court, I was expressing my frustration about the Republicans blocking President Obama from appointing his choice because it was towards the end of his second term. After that, she responded by saying, "The Supreme Court doesn't do anything. That's why citizens don't have a vote." My head nearly exploded. Story 83. When he called my mom and told her I pulled out an implant, I didn't, and had relapsed, I didn't. He said she needed to check up on me. I had received a naltrexone implant after going through a 4-day detox, which isn't truly rapid, as those are typically done in about 8 hours, but it's a similar process. The woman who inserted it ended up reopening the incision when she removed the stitches. She never created a pocket for the implant, causing it to reject and push itself out of my stomach. I never pulled it out. I did relapse, but that was the worst month of my life. I don't know if the Vivitrol injection differs, as it's the same medication, but I have never felt more depressed. I've never been suicidal before, but taking that medication pushed me there, and I don't know why. The sublocade injection turned out to be far more effective for me. I'm rambling, but part of getting the implant required me to attend therapy through the provider affiliated with the clinic, and he was quite unprofessional. I also had a doctor who prescribed Suboxone and had been arrested multiple times for drug offenses. He lost his license in California, Tennessee, and New Jersey and was practicing in New Jersey with a probationary license. He ended up ruining that opportunity and was forced into early retirement. I've encountered a significant number of ineffective therapists, but I really like the one I have now. She has been extremely helpful. I see her today. Story 84. When she had to ask for every single personal detail during each session, such as my husband's name, my son's name, and where I was from, I felt frustrated. I understand having many clients, but isn't this information recorded somewhere? I was gaining nothing from it because each session felt like starting from scratch. Story 85. I spent a full hour listening to the speaker discuss Trump, Hitler, and the nature of group psychology. All of this is very interesting in the right context, but not when I'm paying you $220 per hour to help me with my personal issues. Story 86. I was clinically depressed. He told me, sometimes you just have to push through things. Every appointment. Story 87. When she repeatedly questioned the truth of a recent sexual assault to the point where I ran away and made a statement in the car park, she was fired and can never work in the public system again. There's much more to the story, but that's the overall summary. Story 88. I have several diagnosed and well-documented medical issues. My primary care physician recommended that I see a therapist to discuss the stress related to them. The therapist told me I didn't actually have any medical problems, only anxiety. She claimed that by the time I finished therapy, I wouldn't need to take medications anymore. I did not return. Then there was one who suggested that all my problems would go away if I got married and had children. I finally decided to find my own therapist and luckily found an amazing one who was a perfect fit. Story 89. I saw this once. I got upset talking about something and needed a moment to calm down, so I looked out of the window, and she just would not stop talking while I needed a quiet moment. Story 90. After my best friend died when I was 19, I struggled to process it and spent most of my early 20s in a deep depression. At some point, my mother paid for grief counseling, but I only attended the second session. The counselor seemed to focus solely on the stages of grief, interpreting it as a rigid linear process that I was resisting. Our sessions often felt like her scolding me for not grieving correctly, while she became increasingly frustrated trying to trigger an emotional response from me. What I remember most clearly is her attempt to push me into the anger phase by taunting me about his death and asking how it felt that he chose to take risks that could result in leaving me alone forever. She tried to say anything to elicit a reaction from me, becoming increasingly hurtful in her approach. Unsurprisingly, it did not help, and I retreated back to bed for a few more years, waiting for death. Story 91. I had to cancel a session 24 hours in advance because I was offered a job interview. At the next session, they informed me that they wanted me to pay for the session I missed because it would be beneficial for my mental health to do so. I decided to quit after that session. If they had explained that the cancellation period is 48 hours and that I would need to pay because they couldn't fill the session within 24 hours, I would have accepted it. However, the fact that they were willing to be dishonest with me and claim that paying was somehow part of my therapy revealed their untrustworthiness and greed. I expect a therapist's priority to be my well-being, and it is entirely reasonable to compensate them for their expertise. I do not expect them to prioritize money to the extent that I cannot trust them to be truthful. I sought help for anxiety, not hoarding. Story 92. When they refuse to speak on my behalf to others and persuade them to view me differently and treat me better. Story 93. During my deposition, the defense referenced detailed notes she made, even quoting what I shared in sessions. Apparently, this is legal but falls into an ethical gray area. I also discovered afterward that she is a supporter of the Mormon Church, which did not sit well with me as I have a queer child. Story 94. I went to her for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and she kept insisting I need to medicate my mild depression. Then, when I cured my depression with hormone replacement therapy, She insisted I need to treat my impulsivity. Do you know what makes a girl really impulsive? Unmedicated attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Anyway, I am working up the nerve to fire her this Friday. Advice welcome. Story 95. As a new psychologist, I am appalled at some of the stories I hear from others' experiences in therapy. This discussion highlights how bad some professionals can be in the field. I cannot understand how some therapists end up like those referenced in this thread. You almost have to intentionally choose to be that unprofessional. It is astounding to think how much a good therapist can change a person's life for the better, and conversely, how much damage a poor therapist can do. Story 96. She asked me if my parents were divorced for the third time. I told her during the first session, and I had been seeing her for about 3 months. I remember thinking, what is she writing down if not that? Story 97. I visited a psychiatrist for severe anxiety, panic attacks, and depression. I was unable to work because of these issues, but I volunteered with various mental health organizations. I wanted to enter this field with my psychology degree, and volunteering gave me a sense of purpose by helping others and being in an environment where my struggles were understood. The psychiatrist advised me to stop all my volunteering and claimed that peer support groups were not beneficial, despite many participants expressing that these groups had prevented them from ending their lives. This volunteering was my primary source of motivation. He also suggested that I should get a small job in a store, which I found impossible to do. He then delivered an incredibly patronizing speech about how the world operates, describing how workers lead their lives while their employers drive fancy cars and live in nice houses, implying that I could become one of those workers. This unsolicited speech left me shocked, and I regret not reporting him. I have often experienced this condescension from older male medical professionals as a woman in my early 20s. Story 98. When he wanted me to go back on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder medication just to lose weight, I told him I didn't like taking it anymore. Story 99. When I told my therapist about a healthy life decision I was making, she said, "Oh, don't do that." Additionally, she ended our therapeutic relationship by telling me, "You seem like you're doing well enough on your own," even though I had mentioned that I'm very good at concealing my emotions and often appear fine on the surface, even when I'm not. In stark contrast, I realized how well my current therapist fits my needs when I explained the same healthy decision to her. She gave a perfect response that showed she understood me. I felt genuinely heard and continue to feel that way regularly with her. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.